Welcome back to part two. I'm so glad that you're here to listen to today's interview with Mié Kohiyama. Mié is a French trained journalist and a dedicated child rights activist with over a decade of advocacy experience. As a survivor of child sexual violence herself, she made history as the first survivor in France to appeal to the Supreme Court on the issue of statutes of limitations and repressed memory. Since then, she has been a key figure in the collective movement to end child sexual violence in France. And her activism contributed to major legal victories, including the establishment of a legal age of consent in France and the extension of the statute of limitations for sexual crimes against minors to 48 years. It went from 20 years to 30 years. So now if you are up to the age of 48, you can still seek justice. However, the fight to abolish these limitations entirely is still going on. Mié is also the author of Le Petit Vélo Blanc under the pseudonym Cecile B., in which she shares her journey as a survivor and activist. And in 2022, she joined the Brave movement and now serves as an executive member, which is how I had the pleasure of getting to meet Mié and learn about the work that she's done, continues to do, and continues to fight for. And I'm so honored to have her on this episode to unpack the case of Joël Le Scouarnec and the many victims who are seeking justice in this most recent case where if you listen to part one, I break down the elements of the case, but today we are unpacking those elements in more detail so that we can learn from it. And as I mentioned in part one, this case echoes so many others that we've seen and are really alarm bells ringing to say we must take action and do something because we can't allow these kinds of cases to continue happening and to allow child victims to continue being harmed. Also, I want to say that a reminder, trigger warning for those who are survivors who have experienced issues of repressed memory or have come up against statute of limitations. These conversations can be really frustrating. They can bring up a lot of emotions of anger and frustration, and that's totally understandable. So, if any of this is triggering to you, please be sure to prioritize your mental health and pause this as needed. You will again find resources for mental health support, grounding techniques, survivor support links in the show notes. So please be sure to take advantage of those resources if you need them and stay tuned to the end where we talk about what we can do. So although we're unpacking this case, we are also talking about what are the things that we can do collectively as well as individually to obtain that step forward towards healing or to obtain justice. And of course, to make sure that we are continuing in terms of prevention efforts, whether you are a parent, a caregiver, or someone who works with youth. There is so much that each and every one of us can do. And that's my goal with this podcast always, is not just to talk about the issues at hand or to talk about the problems that we're seeing in the world as it relates to sexual violence and, of course, specifically child sexual violence, but to be able to do something about it, to leave the podcast feeling uplifted and empowered in some way. So stay tuned to the end where me and I talk about what everyone can do, regardless of whether you are a survivor or a survivor ally. In this fight, we can do more to make change. So I invite you to tune in all the way to the end as we unpack this case and all the things that we can do to make positive change in the world. So without further ado, here is my interview with Mié Kohiyama. Mié, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about this case, of course, but all of the issues that surround it. And you have been a leading voice in the fight against child sexual abuse in France. You've personally experienced the devastating impact of statutes of limitations, as one example. Can you share your story with the justice system in France, and what were some of the outcomes from your case?
I had a chance to meet a lawyer that helped me to go up until the Supreme Court, what we call in French Cour de Cassation, to oppose the fact that the French justice didn't want to open an investigation because of statute of limitations. And the argument we used to the Supreme Court was that the repressed memory I've experienced was a kind of, in French law, we say an unsurmountable obstacle, which at this time just existed in case law but didn't exist in law. But we wanted it to become a case law so that every survivors and victims who experience repressed memory and are affected by statute of limitations could have access to justice. And so we went up until the Supreme Court, and the answer was negative. So my case was definitely dismissed. And this is when I joined a collective movement to change laws.
Which is really powerful, and a lot of survivors don't have that ability to do that, right? Because they may just give up, or they may not realize that they can continue to pursue this, and you did. And especially with something like repressed memory, in this particular case is also really important because a lot of those survivors didn't remember the abuse, or they had the trauma in their body, but not the memory of it. And they don't understand why they don't have clear memories, or maybe memories that they think are false. I think a lot of times that can happen. That was similar with my case, where I didn't remember the memories until I became a parent and started teaching my own children about body safety. And then so much came back. And this is really hard, I think, for survivors, obviously emotionally, psychologically, but then when they're faced with the justice system that prevents them from actually seeking justice, that can be really challenging, I think. But your case actually helped to bring attention to this issue in France, which I think is really powerful. Can you explain a little bit more about what statutes of limitations are for those who don't understand what it is? And why is it so important for the legal system to also recognize repressed memories as part of this?
Yes, at least I can speak for France, but I know it's the case in many countries. Statute of limitations in France is what we call, it's like a traditional system that exists in the legal system. And in French, we call it droit à l'oubli, the right to forget. Because the justice system thinks that after a certain time, you can't press charges against perpetrators because of the lack of evidence, because of the disappearing of evidence, because of the fact that witnesses can die, or etc., etc. So it has been in place in France and other countries for many years. In France, we fought a lot against this system for many reasons that I will explain further. But right now, to start with, the law in France allows survivors to press charges until they are 48. So at least right now, the French justice system recognizes that it takes time to have the ability and the capacity because of repressed memory. And I can make more details about it later, but also because it's very hard sometimes because you're imprisoned in many post-traumatic syndrome symptoms, or you have pressures from your families, or you're not just able to press charges. So every legal system now in the world recognize that it takes time. Why it is important to recognize repressed memory? Just if I speak just about my case, but my case is not unique, as the system, what we call repressed memories, when you're raped as a kid. I'm not a doctor, so I will explain things very simply. But the brain has a kind of protection system which create the fact that a little child cannot digest a sexual crime, the torture of a sexual crime for a little child. So there is a system in the brain that makes the memory aside. And this memory can surge like 10, 20, 30, 40 years after, or even never surge. And the research shows that 40 to 60 children who were sexually assaulted are victims of repressed memory. So it's very common.
I was not aware of that. So you're saying 40 to 60% of child victims will have repressed memories
Yes,
of the traumatic sexual experiences. Wow. I
absolutely.
wasn't aware of that. Yeah, that's a really high percentage. And I think that a fact in and of itself, I think is really important for it to recognize. And I think that that's part of the problem. I know we're going to talk about this more, but I think that's part of the issue is that there is such a lack of trauma-informed education for people who are working within the justice system, within the law enforcement system. And then, of course, just a lack of education in general by the public about child sexual abuse. And I think this is also part of why the cases of CSAM, right, child sexual abuse material, are taking so like not seriously because I think people just don't understand the impacts. And I think that brings me back around to my next question, specifically around this case with Le Scouarnec, is that this case exposes massive institutional flaws. When we're talking about the court system and statute of limitation, I think that's an institutional failure to not recognize the science and the data. But in this case, he was a man who was convicted of possessing child sexual abuse material, also known as CSAM. Back in 2005, the FBI had flagged him as seeking and purchasing content from a Russian dark website. And that was in 2004 when he was questioned. What I learned was that he had said to the police officers who were interrogating him that he was just having a marital crisis. I think they interviewed him for 25 minutes at the most and then released him. They didn't even search his home. There was just nothing that was taken seriously about it. And then when he was sentenced, it was a very light sentence. It was 4 months suspended sentence. He was allowed to continue practicing, was not made to get any kind of mental health treatment or psychological treatment. And then he just continued to work. And we know obviously what happened after that. So what does this tell you about how cultures, and I don't think it's just France. I want to say I think this is very similar to many countries around the world, where the impact of CSAM, the consumption, distribution of it, is not taken more seriously. Why do you think that is?
I think this is a very important question. And back in 2005, when this doctor is convicted with this suspense sentence, as you tell, he is hired in a hospital where the head of the hospital, and I will answer to your question like this. He speaks to the head of the hospital 2 years after his conviction and says that he was convicted. And there are proofs during the investigation that the head of the hospital say it happened on the internet. It's not in real life. So you can continue practicing. And the fact is that even now, even it was 20 years ago, but even now, people have difficulties to realize that behind images and videos, there are real children and there are real perpetrators. And also the fact that the perpetrators, the images that are shared by the perpetrators are often the perpetrators themselves. This is a lack of understanding what CSAM is. And with the nowadays in the world, as we have like 100 million images that are shared each year, and it means all the more crimes. And this is a catastrophe that is something that we are not able to tackle as far as we continue to say that these are only in virtuality, and in fact it's not virtual.
And I know that listeners who are listening right now who are survivors, maybe some of them are survivors of CSAM. Um, Even the term, I think, is important that we explain why this term has been changed because it used to be called child pornography. We know that most people have a very different perspective of what they think that is. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's teenagers, and it's just that someone who is over the age of 18 was looking at images of that. Some people think, oh, but it's not, like you said, not a hands-on offense. But the reality is, like you said, there are victims whose images, this is criminal evidence, really, is what it is, which is why the term was changed to child sexual abuse material. I wish that all the media would finally change to saying that instead. But even in law, for example, in the United States, in many states, it is still, the legal term is still child pornography. I think this minimizes the criminal evidence that this actually is. And then also the understanding, I think that this feeds the habits and desires of someone who is already has an attraction to children. This is not, it's giving alcohol to an alcoholic, right? You're not helping them get better by keep allowing them access. So I think that there needs to be more of an education, perhaps, definitely an education within the legal system, whether it's judges or lawyers or police officers. Like, I feel like that's what's needed, but even just for the general public. And I don't know what the answer is to that yet of how we go about doing that. But is there any change in France, for example, on this issue of CSAM? Have attitudes started to shift, or are we seeing that this is maybe the time where we can start to talk about it because it's coming out as one of the issues in this case?
I think it's changing little by little in France because there are a lot of organizations, police officers that are repeating and repeating that, those that are consulting and sharing those images and videos are also children perpetrators. And we are also, all the organizations are repeating the scale of those crimes now. So I think little by little things are changing. But to come back to this affair, back in 2005, there was with Le Scouarnec case, there was this sense that it was only a virtual consultation. And in fact, it is not, as you said, because 3 months later, Dr. Le Scouarnec was raping another child. So it means that there is a direct relationship between consultation, detention, and also hands-off crimes in this case.
Yeah, yeah. I remember reading somewhere that up to 85%, someone who is consuming CSAM has an 85% increased chance of offending, like hands-on offense. So this definitely is increasing the likelihood of hands-on offenses to happen. So I think it's definitely an education that we need to have more conversations around. One of the things that with this medical system, to come back to the case, this failed in so many ways, the medical system as well as the judicial system. And in this case, we're seeing how the legal process itself is also re-traumatizing survivors. It's very clear that the system is not trauma informed. And I was wondering, what do you feel are the biggest judicial failures that you've seen so far in this case? What could be done better? Where is the judicial system even failing already before this case is fully going?
Yes, so to go a little bit before, as you said, just in the investigation, the failure was at the start, meaning that there was, in fact, a search warrant at the time of the CSAM affair, but they spent I think they spent, we have to check the exact facts, but I think it was like 1 hour he had a big house, and they didn't really search his house. In 2005, they actually had the chance to arrest this person. So I can imagine now for the survivors and victims that are in the trial, how hard it is to know that maybe 20 years before, this doctor could have been arrested. The second point in this affair that is striking is the fact that this doctor had notebooks in which he wrote about all the crimes in many details. And this enabled investigators, when they arrested him in 2017, thanks to another victim who was a little girl, this enabled the investigators to find all these victims that are now in the trial, 2099, plus 19 survivors that were affected by statute of limitations. And when they heard them, because of the lack of training and trauma-informed perspective, some of them were learned bluntly that they were victims of these crimes, and they didn't have any memory of it because of repressed memory. And so it was another trauma for many of them to learn that bluntly. And so some of them really, for some of them, it was that they experienced a kind of aftershock, and that was really traumatizing. Some of them were really affected about it. And I think this is really a question we have to think about, how in those cases, and those cases will multiply because now we are, with the longer the investigations are, we know those perpetrators commit crimes all of the years and decades after. So it means that we have to train police officers in a way that they do not traumatize again the survivors, and how can they inform them? How can they prepare such a hearing? How they can, of course, it's a shock, but how can they alleviate a little bit this kind of shock in being more trauma informed and maybe supported by psychologists or but mandatory psychologists.
Yeah, I agree. And I just thinking back also, some of the things that I read were there were at least two victims who committed suicide after learning about it. I think it confirmed the suspicions that they had, or maybe confirmed memories that they weren't sure that were real memories. And I think that's very similar to some other cases that I've seen where the way that police either question witnesses or victims or the way that they present evidence to them was really insensitive. And they, from my understanding, weren't given additional resources for getting support, getting help, especially I think when the judicial system or the law enforcement system actually when they realize how much they messed up, what the failings that they did should have said, we owe it to these victims to do what we can to be as supportive as possible because of our own failings. Like this person continued to harm children. So I think there's so much that should be done. And I don't know if this is true or not, but are any of the victims suing the medical board or any other systems that failed, the judicial system or the law enforcement system? I feel like that is also a place where they might be able to obtain justice beyond just seeing this man go to jail. So, is there any talk of that? Do you know, or is that part of what is going to be tried in this case?
Yes, absolutely. There are some childcare organizations that have filed a complaint to determine the responsibilities. Like we say it's criminal law, but we say obstruction of justice or obstruction of knowing the truth. Yes, there is a complaint underway to try to, and it's not coming from survivors, but from childcare organizations.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that, and I'm actually glad that it is those organizations because I think for a lot of survivors, it's already a lot of weight to bear, and the emotional labor that it takes to continue pursuing cases in courts, I think is really heavy for someone who is already just dealing with the psychological toll that a case like this would take. So I'm glad to hear that there are organizations that are willing to do that. This case also reveals, besides just the institutional failure, also intergenerational silence within family. And I think when the abuse is passed down and concealed in the way that it was, what does this tell you about the way that society really conditions, I think, families to protect perpetrators over children? And how do you think we can begin to dismantle this kind of silence? Because it is one of the most prevalent and one of those first signals. If it's happening within the family, it's one of those first signals. If it doesn't get spoken about or action is taken, then that perpetrator feels they're untouchable and they can continue harming others.
Yes, first of all, to answer your question, it is striking in this case how the silence was maintained, starting from the family. I'm sure you have the detail of all the how do you say, the victims that Dr. Le Scouarnec did in his own family, and the silence was kept by the members of his own family who didn't file a complaint. And what is striking is that this kind of silence and the family members of Dr. Le Scouarnec who testify in court were saying things like, I believed him, it was an incident, and they chose to protect their uncle, their brother, instead of the children. And what it says, I think it says that the family system, which is an institution also, is working the same way as other institutions like church, like school, medical authorities. There's this feeling that the institutions right now are still wanting to protect their peers rather than protecting the children. And this is a paradigm that we have to change. There's no way, there are many stories that are coming out everywhere in the world now that we have victims and courageous survivors that are able to talk. And we see the same patterns everywhere. So the first and foremost thing we have to do and say and repeat and try to convey this message that the protection of children should come first before the institution, the reputation, or the honor of whatever system. And this is a paradigm that we have to shift. And it's up to everyone to do it. It's up to the institution, to the decision makers, to the activists. It's up to everyone to say children protection first.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who has experienced intrafamilial sexual violence in my family, when I look back at some of the signs of who he is and all of the things, there were definitely signs, but I think as sometimes family members, we refuse to see them because it's such an ugly truth. And also, there is a sense of fear that the family will be ostracized. If people find out at church, then nobody was going to want to allow the rest of the family to come to church. And there's this fear that we don't want anyone to discover a secret like this. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to speak out about it publicly, because I think we have to understand an offender is not the entire family. And I think for a lot of people who are in my situation, they're afraid of course, also the denial that you're not going to be believed. And unfortunately, Les Scouarnec's nieces were not believed, right? Like, I think the mother even said, oh, she was lying. I thought she was lying and she was trying to blackmail my husband. And so there's all kinds of reasons I think that people can create as a way to protect really themselves from shame or from fear of what other people are going to think. I think there's a big part of why people keep this silence. But I think what's really important for people to understand when they see cases like this is that it is not protecting this one person. It's actually creating more danger and harm for potentially hundreds of children if one offender is not stopped. It's a very courageous thing, especially after many years. If it happened many years ago, I think it's still important to talk about it and to say this happened many years ago and make sure that person is not around children. It's really challenging. And I just want to acknowledge those who have suffered intrafamilial abuse and were never able to say anything because of those fears, but to recognize that it's never too late to acknowledge it and to potentially, hopefully, if statute of limitations still allow those victims and survivors to come forward, to be able to hold those perpetrators accountable for multiple reasons. One, for your own healing, but also to make sure that they are not continuing to harm others, potentially continue throughout the years. I think a lot of people have this misconception. Les Scouarnec's sister, who said, I thought it was just this one situation. So I think that's really important for people. Again, this is part of the education process of understanding the complexities and the depth of how much harm can be caused when we all stay silent. I agree with you. We just need to keep talking about this and bringing more light and attention to it. So again, thank you. I appreciate that you're here talking to me about this, because this was a situation that you faced within family and being able to try to seek justice so many years later. And you had the courage to do that. So I wanted to also ask you, why is it that once you discovered it, you decided, instead of staying silent and just recognizing this happened to me, that you pursued justice? What was it that motivated you to decide, I have to take this to trial and to court?
First of all, I want to acknowledge what you just said, which is that we as survivors and victims are living in this collective denial against child sexual violence. And breaking the silence within families' institution is not easy. And there shouldn't be any injunction for any to speak, of course, because it's very hard. But we have to remember always that it is the silence that is protecting the perpetrators. I think one of the solutions is to come together as survivors, as victims, as organization, to have a kind of system that is protecting yourself if you're attacked by the institution, by your family, by others when you speak. That's the first point. For me, it didn't come naturally. At first, I was afraid, like anybody. It was back in the early 2000, and I think at this time we didn't have the Me Too movement. So I was confronted, like anyone, to disbelief of myself. When repressed memory is coming out and you have all these kind of memories that are both clear and unclear, there's a certain disbelief of yourself. And as I'm a trained journalist, I was also judging myself. Will people believe me or not? And because of PTSD, which is post-traumatic syndrome I had when the memory of the rape surged, I was in this kind of overwhelming emotions that made me like a little girl. I was afraid that my perpetrator would come and kill me, which is only the effect of the PTSD. So it was not natural for me to file a report, but it came little by little, as because when I imagine that many of your listeners experience that, but because when memories surge, even if these are assaults that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago, they're like as if it happened to you yesterday. They're really present. So I had this feeling that it was very important to press charges against the perpetrator, even if I knew that my case would be dismissed because of statute of limitation. And I did it because I believed, and I still believe, in the judicial system. And I wanted that this person would at least be identified by the justice system, whatever the answer of the justice system would be. And that was something very important for me, which didn't happen, but I really wanted to. And now it happens more. I wanted to be confronted to the perpetrator because I had this memory of this very strong and mean guy of 39. And when I pressed charges, he would have been 75 or 80, something like that. And I wanted to see this old guy and realize I wasn't afraid anymore about him. But this didn't happen because he was heard as a witness and he refused to be confronted to me. But now I must say that the judicial system in France at least has evolved in the sense that even when the case is dismissed and the survivors are asking for a confrontation with the perpetrator, sometimes, of course, if they want it, because it's not easy, of course, and sometimes the judicial system is allowing them to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. And it is really powerful to confront someone who harmed you in that way. And I'm still I remember the last time that I spoke to my father, which was in 2020. I had called him to find out if he was near children, and I hadn't spoken to him before that for about 10 years, so it was very impactful. Like, I remember hearing his voice and all of the things that emotions that come up. It's a really strong emotional experience, really, when we think about having to confront someone. So I think that is part of why it's so difficult for families, and I want to say this is part of, I think, why we chose as co-founders of the Brave movement to say these are a courageous acts to talk about this issue, to confront it, and to especially help others to understand the importance of this issue, especially survivors, right? Because we have always felt so alone for so long. And I think this is the power of this movement and the power of collective conversations, right? To really bring this to light and to help survivors recognize they're not alone, that there is support and they don't have to do it alone. I think that's a really important part of this because when, as a family, you're dealing with these kinds of issues, it is very easy to feel like you're the only one and no one's going to understand, or people are going to turn their back on you. And there's a lot of fear. But when we recognize there is collective power and there are people who want to support and help and bring justice forward, then we just have to find those networks. And I think that that's part of what will help bring these conversations to the forefront, normalize them in the way that we need them to be normalized, which is not to normalize things like CSAM as, oh, it's not a big deal. It's to say these are really important issues. They impact not just children, but people, individuals who become adults, who have to suffer long-term effects of these crimes. And we have to really make more serious efforts to challenge not just the definitions that we have in culture about these crimes, but also to give more support, I think, to survivors, because with that support, I think they would much more easily come forward. And I feel terrible for the nieces, for example, of Le Scouarnec, who were not believed within the family, who could, how much betrayed they would feel knowing that the uncle was protected and was seen as more important. And so what does that say to survivors? So there's so many layers to this case. I think I'm glad that it's being as public as it is. I know it's very difficult for survivors to be on such a public stage this way. So I honor their courage to stand in this case. And it's terrible for those who can't. Now, you said, I think it was 19 victims, survivors, are not able to obtain justice because of the statutes of limitation. When we look at this case, survivors often face disbelief, even within their families. We see it obviously in this case with the ex-wife who denied that she even knew anything, which we now realize was not true. She did know a lot. The sister who protected the brother when the daughter reported him. This, in terms of the family, understanding what happened within the family, there was a Me Too movement, incest movement within France. But this has been, I think a lot of people have said, France has long struggled to acknowledge this as a cultural issue. We look at some of the historical figures who have been writers, poets, artists who have normalized incest, and it has become this part of culture that the society finds very difficult to confront. Why do you think that is? And do you think that the Me Too incest movement in France has actually had an impact, is having an impact? And what do you think this case is going to do in terms of either moving that forward or opening this conversation up?
Yes, so about the Me Too incest, you explained a lot of things that are very true about France. What happened is that the Me Too incest started, Camille Kouchner revealed the incest that her brother was affected from a very powerful person in France, politician, that was president of the Constitutional Court, who is called Olivier Duhamel. And the Me Too incest happened because this was the first time a very powerful man was accused of incest publicly. And I think it really created something special that never happened in France, because about the culture you were talking about in the 70s, especially when those cultural writers and high profile persons were making the apology, there is no other term, of sexual violence on children, saying that it was good for children. Those persons were part of an elite. And what happened in the Me Too incest is that it was a very powerful person who was publicly accused and who was publicly confronted to his crime. And so I think it liberated in a way, because the next few days on social wires, there were like more than 20 or 30,000 tweets about from people saying that there were also been victims of incest. And in France, the statistics show that 3 children per classroom are victim of incest, and 6 million of French people have been victim of incest. So it's very wide. And I think that it was really a liberation because of this public and very powerful figure who was targeted, rightfully. And as far as the Le Scouarnec case is concerned, it's not that I'm pessimistic, but the scale of this trial is terrifying. To think that this man could sexually assault more than 300 children in 3 decades should provoke a shock within the society, within the institution, to say, how can we better the report alerts? How can we lift the statute of limitation? So what happened with this case is, I hope that decision makers will concretely act for not for enabling the society and a better protection for children, because we cannot, it's not the first trial of a large scale, but it's the first trial of this scale. And I don't want to see any other trial of this scale. I wish that it could be a kind of, it could serve as a shock and a awareness for decision makers to take measures that enable things to get better in France.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I hate cases that are this large. It exposes so much harm that was caused. And of course, it's better that this comes to light than to be continued in hiding. But I think what's really powerful about cases like this is that they have the potential to create change. And to me, that's the most important thing is what can we do with the lessons that we've learned in terms of justice and statutes of limitations, because I think this is really an important part of this case. As I mentioned, 19 survivors were barred from seeking justice because of France's 30-year statute of limitations. You've been fighting to abolish these time limits entirely, which I agree with. But many states in the US only they have extended them, but they're still there. And I think it's important to abolish them entirely. So why is this so critical for survivors now more than ever? And I think that just to preface a little bit, also, I think there's a lot of fear from justice systems of what this could mean in terms of overwhelming the system. And I think there's a lot of fear around that as a potential reason. But there's other people who also make the case or argue that these are necessary limitations for fair trials. We know there's cases where these time limits really just protect offenders more than anything. What would you say to those who feel that there is a place for statute of limitations, and why do you think it's critical that they be abolished completely?
So I really think it's critical to abolish them concretely, as you might imagine, because the current knowledge that we have about all this shows that statute of limitations are discriminatory. And just to tell about the case of Joël Le Scouarnec, you have 299 victims, and as you said, 19 victims that are hit by the statute of limitations, which means those survivors will be heard in court as the other victims are, because it's a decision, a personal decision by the judge. So she decided to hear them. And imagine they won't be acknowledged as victims, which is totally unfair. And in matters of all the arguments that the protectors of statute of limitations have, there are, as I said at the beginning, the disappearing of proof, and which is this case also shows it's not the case, because those perpetrators all over the years commit more and more crimes, and at the end you have even more proof about their crimes. So it is very important. And also there is also a constitutional and a European how do you say, perspective, that we should have European law perspective, because in Europe there is a European law that is superior from French law, and that imposes all victims to have access to justice. So if there is statute of limitation, it means that the French law is opposing European law. And so more and more, as the time is passing, there could be cases that are brought to the European Court of Justice, and that could convict the French state for not giving sufficient access to victims. So we have to think about it.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. And in this case, there is actual evidence that his own journal entries for these survivors who are not able to be recognized as victims, but there is clear evidence. I think for those people who say it's not fair in trials because of the length of time and all of this, there was in this specific case proves that there could be, and even with this evidence, they're still not being recognized formally as victims. I think that's really a tragedy, and I'm glad to see that the European law could hold the government to laws to account in France. So I think that's really powerful, and I hope to see this change. But what concrete legal reforms would you also like to see beyond this in France? Because I know statute of limitations is one area, but perhaps other areas as it relates to child sexual abuse material, or are there other laws within France that are also harming victims? And ultimately, telling perpetrators, we're on your side. You get to have impunity because the laws are so weak. Are there other things that should be changed in France regarding child sexual abuse crimes?
Yes, in matters of justice, first to come back also to the argument for statute of limitation, saying that many are afraid that it will produce many victims that will go to court. This is absolutely false, because the laws are not retroactive. So it means that if France and other countries decide to abolish statute of limitation now, it will help the future generation, but not us, and it won't invade any, how do you say, courts. Or there are many laws that should be changed, many reforms, especially in France, where there is a lack of means. The justice have a lack of means. There is a lack of training. In matters of child sexual violence, there are only 4% of child sexual assault survivors that are filing a report, less than 1% that is coming to court. So now before we have what we call a cour d'assises, and they created criminal courts to have more judgments in this matter. But those criminal courts, so Joël Le Scouarnec is judged in front of a criminal court, they were created to have a faster justice. So some rapes that have meant years of suffering for victims are treated in one or a day or a couple of hours. So we need more means for the justice system. There are a lot of problems in matters of reporting, especially when mothers their children have been assaulted or denouncing sexual assaults from their husbands. There's still what we call the alienation parental syndrome that is totally fake in matters of scientific evidence, but that is still invading the spirit or the minds of many judges in France. And most of the times, those mothers cannot protect their children, and the children is given back to the perpetrator. So there's a lot of education that should be done. And also, we are asking for a specialized court, and it goes with the training of the justice professionals, because many times when some judges and investigators are not formed about trauma, they're not able to really gather the evidence and hear and believe really the victims, because they don't have the tips to understand what it means. Like when you're a victim or a survivor and you have syndromes of dissociation, that you have this feeling that you're talking about a crime that happened to you, but you're a little bit a stranger. For investigators that are not trained about this dissociation aspect, they can think that the victims, it's not important, and the victim may lie, which is very important. And in matters of dissociation, it is proved that when the victim is, the more indifferent the victim is, the more maybe in danger she is or he is. And so this is a training that should be done also in matters of trauma, psychotrauma, repressed memory. Repressed memory is also it's also important to train investigators, because when you have repressed memory and traumatic memory, you can have very detailed memories of the crimes, but you can have also a lot of things that you have forgotten. And this proves all the more this is all the more evidence that you have traumatic memory, and that there are investigations that should be made with the little details that you have. But of course, you don't have the whole aspect of all the crimes, and it happens many times.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is essentially all of the systems that treat this crime really need to get educated and trained to know how to deal with all the elements involved, whether it's how to interview a child or a adult survivor, and what judges need to know, what lawyers need to understand. I've seen this so many times with parents who find out, like you said, they discover their child's being abused by a biological parent. And then the courts think that the mother is using that as some excuse to take away custody. In many cases, unfortunately, because of this parental alienation tactic that lawyers will use, the child ends up with the perpetrator under their custody, and essentially gives the abuser full access to continue harming that child. And I think a lot of this does have to do with this lack of training, lack of education, false information from the past that continues to be used and misused, I should say. And everything from the way that survivors or victims are handled in court. And there's so many aspects to it that I think need education. I think just as a culture, as a society, all areas, whether it's the medical field, schools, educators, daycare providers, like across the board, every member in our society really needs to get educated about this issue so that we can do a better job of protecting children and of causing less harm to survivors when they do come forward. So I absolutely agree. I just a couple of last questions before we wrap up, because for those survivors listening, and especially those who are struggling with repressed memories or fear of speaking out, what would you say to them as a survivor and an advocate and an activist? What would you want them to know from your own personal experience?
First, I would like to tell them, I believe you. I hear you. This is a long path. If ever you can, please do reach out for support. I would advise all these survivors to reach out if they can to psychological care, but with professionals who are trauma informed, because not all psychologists are. I think I would advise them to take the time. I would advise them to surround themselves with very people with good intentions. Because sometimes, because of what you were talking about, like the collective denial, I would add also the rape culture, the victim blaming. Sometimes even people that can be close to you can be hurting without intentionally wanting to hurt you. But in the process of recovering a repressed memory, which is a very difficult process, which causes self disbelief, as I told, it's very important to be surrounded by very uh, good intention people and take a lot of care and also take the time. There is no emergency, and this is all the more the reason why we have to abolish statute of limitation. It's not there. There shouldn't be any injunction, any emergency to file a report. You should survivors should do it when they feel like they want to do it. They should take the time. They should be accompanied to do it in the ideal world. But of course, seek the right person, seek the persons that are making yourself feel good. Even if these are different friends or whatever, or different professionals that you didn't think of before. But it's very important because it's a process that is making you very vulnerable. You become very fragile. So it's all the more important to be surrounded by the right persons.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's really important to get a good support system to be by your side through the process because it can have so many ups and downs. And especially after what we talked about, it can sound like if I go and speak up, am I going to get the result that I want? And it's never, of course, guaranteed, like with your case, but you still decided this is the right thing for me. And I just want to echo what you said, getting a support system in place, taking your time, doing it as you are ready. Don't feel forced into it or pushed into it. Take the time that you need to find the right people to support you, to move through the process in the time frame that works best for you. And again, to highlight what you said, this is exactly why the statute of limitations abolition of it is so important, right? Because we need to give survivors the time that they need to process this, to be ready to take on the challenges that come with taking a case to court and facing an abuser potentially. So there's so many parts of it that I don't want people to give up, but to also know that it is possible. There's ways to go about it, and it is a courageous act. And we need to brace ourselves to be able to do that, to take that brave action. So thank you for sharing that with listeners. If listeners do want to take action independently, like not necessarily with their own cases, but to help fight for this kind of justice, whether in France or internationally, what can they do to support this fight for justice?
I would say first, before I answer collectively, I will answer personally. Uh, because my case was dismissed, I engaged in the collective fight against child sexual violence. But there are many different, I would say, healing paths. My path was the action path. My path was to become a public survivor activist. But there are different ways to engage, and there is no injunction to become public, to tell the story. There are many ways to engage to fight against child sexual violence, whether would it be through organizations like the Brave Movement, whether would it be also to, I would say, in your own environment, know the read a little bit documentations, resources to how do you say observe children to know if they to detect the signs that if there's something wrong with them, because the earlier you detect child sexual violence, the better the children can have a better life if they are taken care of and healed. So there are many ways to engage against all this. I would say not being afraid to talk about the issue as a normal issue, because I know there's a lot of fear about it. But the more we talk as normal issue among other issues, the more we can break this kind of silence that is always again protecting the perpetrators. So I think we should be able to speak about this issue seriously, but like another issue, and not making it a taboo or on anything like this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that you gave different ways. I think for sure, if someone wants to say, I want to become an activist or an advocate, I want to protect child rights, there's lots of avenues, including the Brave movement, but so many wonderful organizations that you can join in your communities, whether that's local, regional, or national. There's lots of ways to step into this work. As parents, of course, I always talk about this to get educated so that you can learn how to detect even the signs of grooming before abuse happened. But of course, learning how to tune in so that you are looking for any potential signs and being able to take action right away. So I love that you talk about there's multiple ways that we can do something about this and so that we can collectively make change in the smallest of ways. They all contribute to it, right? It's no action is too small. But I would love for them to continue following you and following the work that you're doing. Mia, I just want to say thank you for your commitment to this issue and for taking the time to join me today. I also want to invite listeners to follow Brave and Be Brave France on social media. So I'll definitely be putting those links in the show notes as well. Mia, I know you're on X as well as other social platforms to follow you on. Are you okay if I add those also to the show notes so people can follow you there?
Yes, of course, Rosalia, and really thank you a lot for your commitment. Thank you for all the work, incredible work you're doing with your podcast. And thank you for your engagement, and to all your listeners that are joining the battle, even listening to your podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, listeners, if you have any questions, please be sure to connect with me on social media and let me know. Please share this episode if you found it valuable. Let others know so that we can continue this collective conversation and make sure that we are highlighting the survivors in this case and giving them our support as well. I think our collective support can give them also the much needed continued effort to stay with this very long case. It's going to be continuing for 4 months. I'm sure I'll be covering some other aspects of this throughout the next few months. I think it's important to keep this case at the forefront, to utilize it as examples of what we can do in our own countries to make sure that we are helping children stay safe and survivors to obtain healing and justice. Again, thank you, Mié, for joining me today. I will continue working alongside you with Brave and all the work we're doing, and I'm so proud to be your colleague in this work. So thanks for joining me, everyone, and we will see you next time.